They didn't just take her land, they erased her from it. The wind moved first, slow across the dry field, carrying dust over what used to be a fence line, over broken posts and a fallen sign that read Whitmore Ranch. The letters split clean through the middle, like a promise no one bothered to keep, and Eliza Whitmore stood there with her boots planted in soil that still remembered her. Even if the town didn't, her hands steady at her sides, not clenched, not shaking, just still, as men in pressed coats and polished belts walked across her yard like it had always belonged to them. Their boots leaving marks where her husband once stood measuring out 50 yards of fence with a piece of twine and a quiet smile. And one of them held a paper up to the light like it was law itself, reading words that sounded official enough to silence anyone who might have cared, though no one spoke, not from the porch across the road, not from the window above the general store, not even from the sheriff leaning against a post with his hat pulled low and his eyes somewhere else entirely. And Eliza didn't look at them. She didn't ask for help. She only bent once, slow, deliberate, and picked something up from the dirt near her boot. Something small, a thin silver bracelet worn smooth at the edges, the kind of thing no one would notice unless they knew what it meant, and she held it for a second longer than necessary before closing her fingers around it. Not tight, just enough to feel its weight, and when she straightened, the man with the paper had already turned his back on her, already calling out measurements like the land was a number now, like memory could be redrawn with ink and distance, and somewhere beyond the far ridge, where the hills folded into shadow and the air carried a different kind of silence, a horse moved. Just once, the sound too distant for most to hear, but close enough to exist, and the rider didn't rush, didn't shout, didn't announce anything at all. He just watched from where the dust thinned out and the sky stretched wider than any man's claim, his hat low, his posture easy, like he had all the time in the world, and back in the yard, one of the men reached for the fence post, testing its strength before pulling it loose from the ground as if it had never belonged there. And Eliza didn't step forward, didn't protest. She only looked once at the line where her land used to begin, and then again at the bracelet in her hand. And something in her eyes shifted, not fear, not anger, something quieter, something that didn't need witnesses. And that's when the horse finally stepped into view at the edge of the road, hooves pressing into dry earth with a slow, even rhythm that didn't match the tension in the air, and a few heads turned, just enough to notice, just enough to wonder, but no one said a word, not yet, because the man on the horse hadn't done anything, hadn't even reached for the reins to stop. He just let the animal carry him forward until he was close enough to see the broken sign, close enough to see the woman standing where a home used to be, and he tilted his head slightly, as if measuring something no one else could see. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't loud, wasn't sharp, just clear enough to settle into the silence like it had always been there. You sure this land was never hers? And the question didn't demand an answer. It just waited, hanging there between the dust and the men and the woman who hadn't moved. And for a moment, nothing responded, not the man with the paper, not the sheriff, not the crowd pretending not to watch. And the rider didn't repeat himself, didn't press. He just looked from one face to another, then down at the ground where the fence post had been pulled free, and somewhere behind the hills, something else began to move, not fast, not loud, just enough to remind the land that it hadn't forgotten anything at all. No one answered him. And that was the first thing that felt wrong, not the silence itself, but how quickly it settled, like the town had been waiting for someone else to carry the weight of a question they all understood but refused to speak. And the man with the paper shifted his stance just enough to remind himself who he was supposed to be, straightening his coat, lifting his chin, letting the authority in his voice come back, piece by piece as he turned halfway toward the rider without fully facing him, as if acknowledging too much might give something away. The land has been reassigned, he said, each word placed carefully, like stepping stones over uncertain ground, legally documented. And he tapped the paper once, a gesture meant to end things, to close the door before it ever opened. But the rider did not look at the paper, not even for a second. His eyes stayed on the ground where the fence post had been, on the line that no longer existed except in memory. And then he looked at Eliza, not long, just enough to notice the way she stood, the way her shoulders did not fold inward the way most would under that kind of pressure, And there was something in that stillness that did not match the story being told, something that did not align with loss or surrender. And he let that sit for a moment before speaking again, quieter this time. "That is not what I asked." And the words did not rise, did not challenge. They simply remained, steady as the horizon. And that made it harder for the man with the paper to ignore, harder for the sheriff to keep his gaze turned away, harder for the others watching from windows and porches to pretend they were not listening. And somewhere behind the crowd, a chair creaked, a door shifted, small sounds that meant attention was beginning to move, slow but certain, like the first stir of wind before a storm that no one could yet see. And the man with the paper cleared his throat, glancing once toward the sheriff as if expecting reinforcement, but none came. The badge remained still, the silence deeper now than before, and that was when one of the hired men stepped forward, not aggressive, not careless, just enough to place himself between the rider and the center of the yard, a quiet reminder of numbers, of control, of how things usually worked in places like this. And he spoke without looking directly at the rider. "You passing through? Mr. Best keep moving." Simple words, common words, the kind that ended most situations before they began. But the rider did not move, did not reach for his reins, did not even shift his weight. He only looked past the man, back to Eliza. And for a brief second, something passed between them. Not recognition, not familiarity, something quieter, like two people standing on the same piece of truth without needing to name it. And Eliza opened her hand just enough for the light to catch the edge of the bracelet, just enough for it to glint once in the sun before her fingers closed again. And that small motion did more than any protest could have, because the rider saw it, and more importantly, someone else did too, far beyond the yard, where the hills began to rise and the air carried the faint scent of sage and smoke. A figure stood watching, still as stone, her dark hair moving slightly with the wind, her eyes fixed on the silver in Eliza's hand. And she did not step forward, not yet, but her presence shifted something unseen, like a thread being pulled taut across distance and back in the yard. The man with the paper grew impatient, the kind of impatience that comes when control begins to slip in ways too subtle to name. "Remove the remaining posts," he said, louder now, directing the order to the men behind him. And one of them hesitated, just for a breath, before moving, gripping another post and testing it. But this time the movement was slower, less certain, as if the ground itself had changed, and the rider finally moved then, not forward, not toward anyone, just enough to guide his horse one step closer, closing the distance by a few feet. And it was a small thing, almost nothing, but it drew every eye in the yard, because he still had not touched his gun, had not raised his voice, had not claimed anything, and yet the space around him felt different now, heavier, like something unspoken had taken shape. And when he spoke again, it was not to the man with the paper, not to the hired men, not even to the sheriff. It was to the space itself, to the silence that had allowed all of this to happen. "If it was never hers," he said, each word slow, measured, "then why does the land still remember her name?" And no one had an answer for that. Not one that could be written, not one that could be stamped or signed. And the wind shifted again, carrying dust across the broken sign, across the boots, across the quiet line where something had been taken but not truly lost. And somewhere beyond the hills, the figure who had been watching took a single step forward, unseen by most, but not by the rider, who did not turn, did not acknowledge, only listened to the change in the air as if it mattered more than anything said aloud. The air did not move the same way anymore, not after that question, not after the land itself had been named as something that could remember, and even the men who had come with purpose began to feel it, that faint shift beneath their boots, not physical, not something they could point to, but enough to slow their hands, enough to make the next fence post feel heavier than the last. And the man gripping it paused again, longer this time, his fingers tightening not from effort, but from uncertainty. And he glanced back without meaning to, searching for direction that no longer felt solid, while the man with the paper noticed it too, the hesitation, the way control was slipping in small, almost invisible cracks. And he stepped forward with sharper intent, his voice cutting through the quiet like he could restore order simply by raising it. "Do not stop now," he said, not loud enough to shout, but firm enough to remind them of why they were there. of what had already been decided, and the words pushed the man at the fence just enough to act, just enough for him to pull again. But even as the wood shifted slightly in the ground, the sound it made did not carry the same certainty as before. It echoed differently, like something resisting in a way no one could quite explain, and Eliza heard it, felt it, but she did not step forward, did not interrupt. She only opened her hand once more, letting the bracelet rest in her palm, and this time she looked down at it, not at the men, not at the rider, but at the worn silver that had outlasted seasons, storms, and promises. And her voice came then, soft, almost lost in the wind, but steady. "It was given," she said, not to anyone in particular, not even raising her head, not sold, not claimed, given, and the word settled into the space. Differently than the others had, because it did not argue, it did not defend, it simply existed, and the rider heard it, turned his head just slightly, not fully, just enough to catch the meaning behind it. And that was when the figure from the hills moved again, stepping into clearer view now, her presence no longer just a shadow against the land, but a form that carried weight, purpose, and something older than the town itself. And she did not hurry, did not call out. She walked with a calm that made distance feel irrelevant, her eyes never leaving Eliza's hand, never leaving the silver that caught the sun with each step, and one by one, the men in the yard began to notice, first the ones closest to the road, then the others, their attention drawn not by sound, but by something quieter, something that made them turn before they understood why. And the sheriff saw her too, his posture shifting for the first time, not fear, not respect, something in between, something that recognized presence without needing introduction. And the man with the paper followed their gaze, his expression tightening as he took in the approaching figure, calculating, adjusting, trying to place her within the rules he believed governed this place. But there was no paper in her hand, no claim to read, no authority to display, only the steady rhythm of her steps and the silence that followed her like a shadow. And when she reached the edge of the yard, she stopped, not crossing into it, not claiming space that was not hers. And for a moment she said nothing, letting the wind carry the dust between them, letting the land settle around the truth it already held. And then she spoke, her voice low but clear, shaped by a language older than the lines drawn on any map. "That was not meant to be taken back," she said. And though her words were simple, they carried something the others did not, something that did not need proof because it existed before proof was ever required. And the man with the paper straightened again, his confidence returning in fragments, clinging to the structure he understood. "This matter has been settled," he replied, turning toward her with a measured tone. "This land falls under new ownership," and he lifted the document slightly, as if it could bridge the gap between what he believed and what stood before him. But the woman did not look at it, did not acknowledge it. Her gaze remained on Eliza, on the bracelet, and then shifted, slowly, to the rider, meeting his eyes for the first time. And something passed there, quiet recognition, not of name, not of identity, but of position, of choice, of what stood between action and restraint. And the rider did not nod, did not respond. He only held that gaze for a breath longer than necessary before looking back to the yard, back to the men who now stood unsure of where to place themselves, unsure of which voice to follow. And the space between all of them grew tighter, heavier, filled with something that could not be written down or dismissed. And the man at the fence released his grip without realizing it, letting the post settle back into the ground by an inch, maybe less, but enough to change the line once again. And no one spoke to correct it. No one stepped forward to finish what had been started, because something had shifted beyond orders, beyond papers, beyond the quiet agreement that had allowed this to happen in the first place. And the rider finally moved his hand, not to his weapon, not to assert force, but to rest it lightly against the saddle horn, grounding himself in the moment as he looked once more at Eliza, then at the woman from the hills, and then at the man with the paper. And when he spoke again, his voice carried no weight of authority, no threat, only a simple clarity that made everything else seem unnecessary. Then it was never theirs to give away. And this time, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something waiting to be acknowledged, something that had been there long before any of them arrived. and for the first time since the morning began, the land felt like it was listening. The words did not fall away when he said them. They stayed, settled into the ground, like something finally spoken out loud after years of being carried in silence. And no one reached to argue it right away, not even the man with the paper, because something in the way it was said left no space for quick answers, only slow thinking. And that was something this town had not done in a long time. And the wind moved again, softer now, brushing past the broken sign, past the loosened fence post, past Eliza, who still stood where she had been, but not the same as before, because now she was no longer standing alone in what she knew. And the woman from the hills stepped forward at last, crossing into the yard with a calm that did not ask permission, her boots pressing into the soil as if she had always walked there. And she stopped beside Eliza without touching her, without claiming her, only standing close enough to share the same ground. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because the truth between them did not need words. And the bracelet in Eliza's hand caught the light once more. And this time the woman from the hills lifted her gaze to it fully. And there was something like memory in her eyes, something older than either of them, something that did not belong to the town or the men or the paper held between trembling fingers. And when she spoke again, her voice carried not just across the yard but through it, as if it moved through the land itself. It was given so the land would be cared for, she said, each word steady. Not owned, not traded, cared for. And the difference settled heavier than anything that had come before, because it shifted the meaning of everything the men believed they had come to do. And the man with the paper felt it, the ground of his certainty giving way beneath him in ways he could not measure. And he tried to steady himself with the only thing he trusted, lifting the document again, his voice tighter now, more controlled. Agreements do not hold without record, he said, almost to himself as much as to them. What is not written cannot be proven. And for a moment it sounded convincing, because it had always been enough before. But the writer turned his head, slightly, not toward the paper, not toward the man, but toward the people watching, the ones behind windows and doors, the ones who had lived beside this land long enough to know its seasons, its droughts, its quiet endurance. And he spoke not louder, not sharper, just clear enough to reach them. Then why does everyone here know her name? And this time the silence broke differently, not from force, not from fear, but from recognition. And a voice came, hesitant at first, from the porch across the road, an older man who had watched more years than he cared to count. Her husband built that well himself, he said, not stepping forward, not raising his voice, just stating something simple, something true. And another voice followed, from the open window above the store, kept it running through the dry summer 2 years back. And then another, and another, not loud, not united, but enough to shift the weight of the moment from one side to the other. And the sheriff finally straightened from his post, not with authority, not with command, but with a quiet discomfort that had grown too large to ignore, his hand resting at his side as he stepped forward one pace into the yard, his eyes moving from the paper to the land to the people who had begun to remember out loud. And the man with the paper saw it all unraveling in small, unstoppable pieces, the kind that could not be gathered back once they began to fall. And he lowered the document slightly, just an inch, just enough to reveal the doubt he could not hide. And that was when the woman from the hills reached out, not toward him, not toward the paper, but toward Eliza's hand, not touching it, only hovering close enough to acknowledge what she held. And she said quietly, "This was given when the rains did not come, when your husband stayed when others left." And Eliza's breath caught, not from surprise, not from fear, but from recognition, because that was not a story told in town, not something written or recorded, but something lived, something earned. And the writer watched it all without moving, without claiming anything for himself, his presence unchanged, steady as it had been from the moment he arrived. And the men who had come to take the land began to step back without being told, not in retreat, not in defeat, but in uncertainty, the kind that makes a man reconsider the ground beneath his own feet. And the fence post that had been pulled loose stood slightly tilted now, not fully removed, not fully placed, caught between two states, just like the moment itself. And no one reached to move it, because no one was sure anymore which direction it should go. And the wind passed through again, carrying dust across the yard, across the paper, across the boots of men who no longer stood as firmly as before, and for the first time since morning, the line that divided what was hers and what was not began to look less like a boundary and more like a question waiting to be answered the right way. No one moved to pick the paper back up when it slipped lower in the man's hand, and that small detail carried more weight than any argument that had been made, because it meant something had already been lost, not the land, not yet, but the certainty that had brought them there in the first place, and the sheriff felt it more than anyone, the quiet shift of responsibility settling onto his shoulders like dust that would not brush away. And he took another step forward, slow, deliberate, not as a man of authority, but as someone finally choosing where to stand, his boots pressing into the same soil he had ridden past 100 times without thinking, and now it felt different under him, like it was asking something in return, and he looked at Eliza, really looked this time, not at a situation, not at a problem, but at a person who had remained steady when everything around her had tried to erase her. And then he looked at the woman from the hills, whose presence had brought something into the open that no badge or paper could define. And finally, he looked at the man with the document, who now held it with less conviction than before, and the sheriff spoke, not loudly, not to command, but to clarify. If there is doubt, he said, choosing each word with care, then this does not move forward today. And the sentence landed with a quiet finality that no one immediately challenged, because it did not accuse. It did not oppose. It simply paused what had been set in motion, and sometimes that was enough to change everything. And the man with the paper opened his mouth as if to respond, to restore the direction he had lost. But the words did not come the same way they had before, because now they had to pass through something new, something that had not been there when he first stepped into the yard, the awareness that others were no longer silent, that the ground he stood on was no longer unquestioned. And he lowered the paper another inch, just enough to fold it slightly at the corner, a sign so small it might have been missed. Except nothing was being missed anymore, and the hired men who had come with him shifted their weight, not in readiness, not in defiance, but in uncertainty, the kind that makes a man reconsider the next step before taking it. And one of them reached down without thinking and set the loosened fence post upright again, pressing it gently back into place, not fixing it, not restoring it fully, but enough to hold its position, enough to say that it was not ready to be removed. And that single act, done without instruction, carried through the yard like a quiet decision being made by more than one person at once. And Eliza saw it, her eyes following the movement. And for the first time since morning, her shoulders softened, not in relief, not yet, but in recognition that something had shifted beyond her control, beyond her need to defend or explain, and she opened her hand again, looking at the bracelet not as proof, not as a tool, but as something that had carried a promise longer than she had understood, and she closed her fingers around it once more before lifting her gaze to the rider, who still sat on his horse with the same stillness, the same restraint, as if none of this had surprised him, and perhaps it had not, and their eyes met for a brief moment, and there was no gratitude spoken, no acknowledgement needed, just a quiet understanding that he had not come to take anything, only to stand where others would not. And then the woman from the hills turned slightly, her attention moving from Eliza to the line of land that stretched beyond the yard, beyond the broken sign, beyond the place where fences had been drawn and redrawn by men who believed they could define something larger than themselves. And she stepped forward one pace, placing her foot just past the line where the post had been disturbed, and she did not claim it, did not mark it. She only stood there, grounding the space in a way that made it feel whole again. And when she spoke, it was not to argue, not to persuade, but to remind. The land remembers who stayed when it was hard, she said, her voice steady as the wind that moved across the field, and it does not forget easily. And no one answered her, because there was nothing to answer, only something to accept. And the sheriff nodded once, not to her, not to anyone in particular, but to the moment itself, acknowledging that what had been assumed was no longer certain. And he turned slightly toward the man with the paper, his tone still calm, still measured. You can return when this is settled properly, he said, but not like this. And that was the closest thing to a line being drawn that day, not in the dirt, not with wood or wire, but in the space between what was allowed and what was no longer ignored. And the man with the paper hesitated, just for a breath, before folding the document fully and lowering his hand to his side. And without another word, he turned, signaling to the others with a small motion that carried no pride, no victory, only acceptance of something unfinished, and they began to move away, not hurried, not defeated, but quieter than they had arrived, their boots leaving lighter marks in the dust, as if they were no longer certain they had the right to press so hard. And the yard slowly emptied of them, leaving behind only the tilted fence, the broken sign, the woman who had stood her ground, the rider who had never raised his voice, and the presence from the hills that had reminded them all of something they had nearly forgotten. And as the last of the men reached the road, the wind lifted again, carrying dust across the space where the line had almost been erased, and this time, it settled differently, not as something taken, but as something still there, waiting to be cared for. The dust did not settle the same way after they left. It lingered, drifting low across the ground as if the land itself was thinking, holding on to what had almost been taken and what had quietly returned. And for a long moment no one spoke, not Eliza, not the sheriff, not even the people watching from the edges of the town who now stood a little closer than before, drawn in by something they could not quite explain. And the rider finally shifted, just slightly, guiding his horse a few feet forward before stopping again, not claiming the space, not stepping into it fully, only closing the distance enough to make what came next feel closer to the truth than to chance. And Eliza turned toward him then, her fingers still wrapped around the bracelet, her voice steady but softer now. "You did not have to stop," she said, not as a question, not even as thanks, just an observation placed gently into the quiet. And the rider looked at her, really looked this time, and there was something in his eyes that did not belong to this moment alone, something older, something that had carried him here long before the dust rose this morning. And he answered simply, "Yes, I did." And that was all. No explanation, no story offered, just a truth that did not need more. And the woman from the hills watched the exchange without interrupting, her gaze moving between them as if measuring something unseen. And then she stepped back one pace, not leaving, not retreating, just allowing space to return to the land between them. And the sheriff cleared his throat, the sound small but noticeable now that everything else had quieted. And he removed his hat slowly, not out of habit, not out of formality, but because it felt like the right thing to do. And he spoke to Eliza. "This will need to be reviewed," he said, choosing his words carefully, properly this time. And Eliza nodded once, not hopeful, not doubtful, just accepting the next step as something that would come whether she asked for it or not. And the sheriff turned then, looking out toward the town, toward the faces that had begun to step forward. And there was something different in the way they stood now, less distance, less hesitation, as if the silence they had held before no longer fit as comfortably as it once had. And one by one, they began to move, not rushing, not crowding, just closing the space that had separated them from what was happening. And an older woman approached first, her hands worn from years of work, her steps careful but certain, and she stopped a few feet from Eliza, looking at the ground, at the broken sign, at the fence that stood half set, and she said quietly, "We remember." And that was all, but it was enough. Enough to carry more weight than anything written on paper. And others followed, not speaking loudly, not making declarations, just standing closer, present in a way they had not been before. And the rider watched it without interfering, his role already complete in a way that did not need acknowledgement. And he turned his horse slightly, not away, not yet, just enough to face the road again, as if preparing for something that did not belong to this place. And Eliza noticed, her eyes following the movement. And for a brief moment something like a question passed through her expression, not about who he was, but about why he would leave without taking anything in return. And the woman from the hills saw it too. And she spoke softly, not to Eliza alone, but to the space between them. "Some men do not stay where they are not needed," she said, her voice carrying a quiet understanding that did not need further explanation. And Eliza lowered her gaze for a moment, looking at the bracelet once more before slipping it onto her wrist, where it rested as if it had always belonged there. And when she looked up again, the rider was already turning, his horse stepping onto the road with the same steady rhythm it had carried from the hills. And he did not look back immediately, did not pause for acknowledgement, but as he reached the edge of the yard, he stopped once more, just for a second, and without turning fully, he said, "Take care of it." And whether he meant the land, the promise, or something else entirely, no one could say for certain, but the words settled just the same, and then he moved on, the sound of hooves fading slowly into the distance, leaving behind a space that felt different, not empty, not quiet in the same way as before, but full of something that had been missing, something that had returned without force, without claim. And as the town gathered closer around the yard, around Eliza, around the line that had almost been erased, the wind passed through one last time, softer now, carrying with it not the weight of what had nearly been lost, but the quiet certainty of something still standing, something that had not needed to be defended with anything more than the truth and the courage to remain where it belonged. The sound of the horse faded long before the feeling of his presence did, and that was the part no one spoke about, not the rider, not his face, not even the words he left behind, but the way the air held on to something steady after he was gone, like a door had been opened and no one was quite ready to close it again. And Eliza stood there a while longer, not moving toward the house, not rushing to reclaim anything, just letting the moment settle into something real, something she could trust. And the bracelet rested against her wrist now, warm from her skin, heavier than before in a way that had nothing to do with its weight, and she looked down at it once, then out across the land that stretched beyond the broken fence, the same land she had walked every morning, measured in steps and seasons, now looking back at her like it had been waiting for her to see it differently. And the people who had gathered did not leave right away. They stayed, some standing with hands in pockets, others with arms folded, not speaking much, but not turning away either. And that quiet presence felt like something new, something the town had not offered her before, not in words, but in willingness. And the older woman who had spoken earlier stepped closer, bending slightly to pick up a piece of the fallen sign, brushing the dust from it with slow, careful movements, as if the name written there still mattered. And she set it upright against the fence post, not fixing it, not repairing it, just placing it where it could be seen again. And that simple act carried through the yard like a promise being made without announcement. And Eliza watched it, her eyes softening for a moment before she turned toward the woman from the hills, who had not moved far, who now stood near the edge of the yard where the land began to open, her gaze still steady, still holding that quiet sense of knowing. And Eliza took a step toward her, then another, closing the space that had once felt uncertain. And when she stopped a few feet away, she did not ask questions, did not search for explanations. She only said, "He never told me it meant this." And the woman from the hills nodded once, her expression unchanged but not distant. "Some things are not meant to be explained," she replied, "only honored." And Eliza let that settle, not as an answer, but as something she did not need to understand fully to accept. And behind them, the sheriff spoke again, quieter now, addressing the small group that remained. "We will need statements," he said, not as an order, but as a way forward, something to hold on to now that the moment had passed. And a few people nodded, stepping forward in small, uneven movements, offering pieces of memory, of seasons, of work done and witnessed, not loud, not formal, but enough to build something stronger than silence. And the yard slowly began to take on a different shape, not just a place where something had almost been lost, but a place where something had been returned. And Eliza turned back once more toward the open land, her eyes tracing the line where the fence had been disturbed, and she walked to it, placing her hand on the post that had been set back into the ground, pressing it down just slightly, firming its place. And it held, not perfectly, not yet, but enough to stand. And she stayed there for a moment, her hand resting on the wood, feeling the grain beneath her fingers, the small imperfections that made it real. And she drew in a slow breath, the kind that comes after something heavy is past, and let it out just as slowly. And when she turned back, the woman from the hills had already begun to step away, not hurried, not unnoticed, just returning to where she had come from, her presence fading into the distance as quietly as it had arrived. And Eliza watched her go, not calling after her, not trying to stop her, because something told her that this was the way of it. That not everything that helped you stay was meant to stay with you. And as the sun shifted slightly in the sky, casting longer shadows across the yard, the town began to move again, not back to what it had been, but forward into something that felt just a little more awake, a little more aware of what it meant to stand by something instead of stepping aside. And Eliza remained by the fence a while longer, her hand still resting there, her eyes steady on the land that had almost been taken, and, in the quiet that followed, there was no need for more words, no need for more proof, only the understanding that some lines were not drawn by paper or power, but by those who chose to stand when it mattered, and by the land that chose to remember them. Morning came slower than it used to, or maybe Eliza just noticed it now, the way the light stretched across the field inch by inch, touching the fence posts one at a time as if counting them, making sure each one was still there, and she stepped out onto the porch with the same quiet rhythm she had kept for years, boots finding the worn boards without looking, hand resting briefly on the doorframe before letting go, and the air felt different. Not lighter, not easier, but clearer, like something had been set back into place even if the work was not finished, and she walked out toward the fence again, the bracelet catching the early sun with a soft glint that moved with her. And when she reached the post she had steadied the day before, she pressed it once more, testing it, not out of doubt, but out of care, and it held firmer this time, the soil around it packed tighter, as if the land itself had decided to keep it. And she nodded slightly, not to anyone, just to the moment. And behind her, footsteps approached across the yard, slow but purposeful, and she did not turn right away. She waited until the sound settled beside her, and then she looked to see the sheriff standing there, hat in hand again, his posture less guarded than before, more human, and he glanced at the fence, then at the land beyond it, and finally at her. "We started the review," he said, his voice low, steady, records, statements, everything we could find. And he paused for a breath, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what he was about to admit. There is no clear transfer, nothing that holds the way they said it did. And Eliza listened without interrupting, her eyes steady on the horizon, and after a moment she asked, "So it stays like this?" And the sheriff nodded. "For now, yes." And the words carried both uncertainty and something close to relief, because sometimes not. Moving forward was the only way to keep from moving the wrong way again. And he shifted his weight slightly, looking down at the bracelet on her wrist. "That piece," he said, not pointing, not intruding. "You said it was given." And Eliza lifted her hand just enough for him to see it clearly, the worn silver, the edges smoothed by time. "It was his," she said quietly, "but not from here." And the sheriff nodded again, slower this time, understanding not fully formed, but present enough to matter. And he stepped back after a moment, placing his hat on his head again as if returning to a role he now carried differently. "We will keep watch," he said, not as a promise, but as a commitment. And then he turned, walking back toward the road with measured steps that no longer avoided the ground beneath them. And Eliza remained where she was, her gaze moving across the field, following the line of sunlight as it spread, touching the edges of things that had been uncertain just a day before. And from the far side of the land, beyond the gentle rise where the grass grew a little thinner, a figure stood again, distant but clear in the morning light. And Eliza saw her without surprise, the woman from the hills, watching not with urgency, not with expectation, but with quiet acknowledgement. And this time Eliza lifted her hand slightly, not waving, not calling out, just enough to be seen. And after a moment, the figure inclined her head once, a small motion that carried more meaning than words could hold. And then she turned, moving back toward the hills with the same calm she had always carried, leaving the land to those who would remain. And Eliza lowered her hand, the bracelet, settling back against her wrist as if it had always been there. And she took a slow breath, filling her lungs with the scent of earth and morning, and let it out just as slowly. And behind her, the town began its day, doors opening, voices rising, not louder than before, but different, less distant, more present. And she did not turn to watch it. She did not need to, because what mattered stood in front of her, the fence, the field, the line that had almost been erased now holding steady in the light. And she stepped forward, one foot crossing the place where the boundary had shifted, and then the other, not claiming it, not defending it, just walking it the way she always had, measuring it not in ownership, but in care, in memory, in the quiet understanding that some things are not kept by force or paper, but by those who remain when it would be easier to leave. And as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows that slowly shortened with the passing hours, the land did not speak. It did not need to, because everything it needed to say was already there, in the way it held the fence upright, in the way it reflected the light back into her eyes, in the way it remembered, and far beyond the road, beyond the edge of the town where dust met distance, a lone rider paused for just a moment on the ridge, looking back once, not long, just enough to see the line still standing, and then he turned his horse and rode on, leaving no mark that would last, and yet leaving something behind that would not be forgotten. By the third morning, the land had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new, the kind of quiet that comes after something has been tested and chosen to remain. And Eliza rose before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the sky still holding that pale gray blue that sits between night and day, and she stepped outside with a bucket in hand, not out of urgency, not out of routine alone, but because there was work to be done, and she had decided, without saying it out loud, that the work mattered again, and the ground beneath her boots felt firm, not just from the packed soil around the fence posts, but from something deeper, something that had returned to its place without needing to be announced. And she walked the line slowly, stopping at each post, pressing, adjusting, straightening where needed, not rebuilding all at once, not rushing to make it perfect, but restoring it piece by piece, the way it had been built the first time, with patience instead of certainty. And when she reached the edge near the old well, she paused, setting the bucket down and resting her hand on the worn wood of the frame, the same place her husband had stood years before, measuring, fixing, staying when others had left. And she closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in grief, not in longing, but in acknowledgement of something that had never truly been lost. And when she opened them again, she noticed movement near the road, not hurried, not hidden, just a figure approaching with steady steps. And as it drew closer, she recognized the older man from the porch, the one who had spoken up the day before, his hat low, his pace careful but determined, and he carried something in his hands, a length of rope coiled neatly, the fibers worn but strong. And he stopped a few feet from her, not stepping onto the land without pause. And he said, "Figured you might need this," and held it out, not offering help as a favor, but as something that should have been done all along. And Eliza looked at the rope, then at him, and nodded once before taking it, her fingers brushing the rough texture, grounding the moment in something real. "Thank you," she said simply, and the man gave a small nod in return, not staying long, not making more of it than necessary. And he turned back toward the road, leaving her with the rope and the understanding that the town was no longer standing apart from what happened here. And as the morning light grew stronger, others came, not all at once, not in any organized way, but one by one. A woman with a hammer, a young boy carrying nails and a small tin, another man with a plank balanced across his shoulder, each arriving without announcement, without asking permission, just stepping into the work that had been left undone. And Eliza did not direct them, did not assign tasks. She simply worked alongside them, tying the rope where the fence had loosened, holding a post steady while another secured it, the rhythm of their movements finding a quiet harmony that did not need words. And the land seemed to respond, the way dust settled more quickly under their feet, the way the posts stood firmer with each adjustment, as if the ground itself recognized the difference between being taken and being cared for. And by mid-morning, the line of the fence began to take shape again, not exactly as it had been, not perfectly straight, but honest in its form, marked by the hands that had chosen to rebuild it. And Eliza stepped back for a moment, wiping her hands against her skirt, her gaze moving along the length of it, and she felt something shift inside her, not relief, not pride, something quieter, something steady, and she turned toward the road, half expecting to see the rider there again. But there was nothing, only the open stretch of dirt leading out of town, and she did not feel disappointment, not in the way she might have before, because she understood now that some people pass through not to stay, but to remind others how to stand. And as the sun climbed higher, casting stronger light across the field, the work continued without urgency, without tension, just a steady movement forward, and near the far end of the fence, where the land dipped slightly before rising again toward the hills, Eliza noticed something small tied to one of the posts, something that had not been there before, and she walked toward it slowly, her steps measured, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she drew closer. And when she reached it, she saw a thin strip of leather, wrapped once around the wood, holding a small piece of turquoise that caught the light with a soft, quiet glow, and she touched it gently, not removing it, not questioning it, just feeling its presence. And she knew without being told where it had come from, and what it meant, and she stepped back after a moment, leaving it there, part of the line now, part of the story that was still unfolding. And when she turned again toward the field, the wind moved across it in a long, slow sweep, bending the grass just slightly before letting it rise again. And for the first time in a long while, the land did not feel like something she had to defend. It felt like something she belonged to, something that had chosen to remain with her as much as she had chosen to remain with it. And somewhere far beyond the ridge, where the road disappeared into distance, a rider continued on without looking back, not because he had forgotten, but because he knew there was nothing left to take, and nothing left to prove, only the quiet certainty that the line would hold, not by force, not by paper, but by the people who had finally remembered what it meant to stand on it. By late afternoon, the line of the fence stood complete enough to be trusted, not perfect, not straight in the way a surveyor might demand, but true in a way that mattered more. And Eliza walked it again with slower steps, not searching for flaws, but recognizing the work that had been done, each post carrying a different hand, a different choice. And when she reached the far end where the small piece of turquoise rested against the wood, she paused, letting her fingers hover near it without touching, as if even that small act required respect. And the light caught it again, softer now under the lowering sun, and something about it felt less like a marker and more like a witness. And behind her, the voices of the town had faded, the helpers long gone back to their routines, leaving the land quiet once more, but not empty, never empty again in the same way. And she turned back toward the house, taking her time, her boots pressing into the soil with a steadiness that matched her breathing. And when she reached the porch, she stopped, looking out across the field, the repaired fence drawing a quiet line between what had been questioned and what now stood without needing defense. And she leaned one hand against the post, the wood warm from the day's heat, and she allowed herself a moment, not to rest, not to reflect, but simply to stand in the space that had nearly been taken from her and now felt different, not because it was hers again, but because it had never truly stopped being so. And the sound of distant hooves reached her then, faint, almost lost in the wind, and she did not turn quickly, did not rush to the edge of the yard. She only shifted her gaze slightly toward the horizon, and there, far beyond the ridge, a small shape moved against the fading light, steady, unhurried, and she watched it for a moment before lowering her eyes again, not holding on to it, not needing to, because whatever had brought him here had already done its work. And the evening settled slowly, shadows stretching long across the field, softening the edges of everything. And Eliza stepped inside to light the lamp, the glow filling the small room with a quiet warmth that felt earned. And when she returned to the doorway, the sky had turned deeper, the first stars beginning to show above the distant hills, and the land lay still under that wide sky, the fence holding its line, the posts standing where they had been set by hands that chose to stay. And she rested her hand once more on the bracelet at her wrist, feeling its presence as something more than memory, something that connected what had been given to what had been kept. And she closed her eyes for a brief second, not in prayer, not in hope, but in acknowledgement. And when she opened them again, the world in front of her had not changed, but her place within it had. And the next morning would bring more work, more decisions, more quiet moments that no one else would see. But for now, she stood in the doorway as the light faded, the wind moving gently across the field, carrying with it the last traces of the day. And in that quiet, the land did not ask for proof. It did not demand defense. It simply remained. And so did she, not because she had won something, but because she had never truly lost it. And that was enough, more than enough, to let the night come without fear, to let the silence settle without doubt, and to trust that when the sun rose again, the line would still be there, not drawn by force, not held by paper, but kept by those who understood what it meant to belong to something and to be remembered in return. The night passed without disturbance, and that in itself felt like something earned rather than expected. And when the first light of dawn stretched across the land again, it revealed not just the fence standing where it should, but small details that had gone unnoticed before, footprints softened by wind, the faint impression of wagon tracks already fading, the kind of quiet signs that marked the difference between something that had passed through and something that had chosen to remain. And Eliza stepped out onto the porch once more, her movements unhurried, her eyes adjusting to the light as she took in the field, the posts, the line that now felt less like a boundary and more like a promise kept, and she moved toward it again, not because she needed to check it, but because it had become part of her rhythm, part of how she measured the day. And as she walked, she noticed something new near the far end, something small resting against the base of one of the posts, and when she reached it, she saw a folded piece of cloth, simple, unmarked, placed with care, rather than carelessness, and she bent slowly to pick it up, her fingers brushing against the fabric before lifting it. And when she unfolded it, she found inside a handful of seeds, dark, smooth, the kind that held life quietly until given the chance to grow. And she stood there for a moment, looking at them, not questioning where they had come from, not needing to, because some things arrived without explanation and still carried meaning. And she closed her hand gently around them, not tight, just enough to hold them. And she glanced once toward the hills, where the morning light was just beginning to touch the higher ground. And there was no figure there now, no movement to mark a presence, only the stillness of distance. And yet the gift felt connected to that place, to the same quiet understanding that had brought the bracelet, the turquoise, the reminder that not everything needed to be written to be real. And she slipped the seeds into the pocket of her dress before continuing along the fence, her steps steady, her gaze moving from post to post. And when she reached the well again, she stopped, setting her hand against the wood as she had done the day before, and she looked out across the land, imagining where those seeds might take root, where something new might grow alongside what had been preserved. And behind her, the sound of a wagon approached slowly, wheels turning against the dirt with a familiar rhythm, and she turned to see the sheriff arriving, not alone this time, but with another man seated beside him, older, carrying a leather satchel that suggested records, not authority. And they pulled to a stop near the edge of the yard, the sheriff stepping down first, his movements calm, deliberate, and he approached with a nod. "We brought someone to look at the records properly," he said, his tone steady, not defensive, not uncertain, just moving forward in the way he had promised. And the older man followed, opening his satchel carefully, removing papers that had been kept, preserved, not as claims, but as histories. And Eliza stepped closer, not anxious, not eager, just present. And the man began to speak, not in long explanations, not in complicated terms, but in clear, measured words, tracing back what had been recorded, what had been assumed, what had been left unwritten but remembered. And as he spoke, the pieces began to settle into something clearer, not perfect, not absolute, but honest enough to hold. And the sheriff listened alongside her, his gaze shifting between the papers and the land itself, as if understanding now that one without the other could never be complete. And when the man finished, he closed the satchel with a quiet finality. "There is no rightful claim that removes her from this land," he said, not loudly, not as a declaration, but as a conclusion reached through care. And the sheriff nodded once, a small motion that carried more weight than it had before, and he turned to Eliza. "It stays with you," he said, and this time the words did not feel temporary, did not feel like a pause. They felt like something that would hold. And Eliza did not respond right away. She only looked out across the field again, the fence standing, the posts firm, the line clear, and she reached into her pocket, feeling the seeds resting there, and she drew them out slowly, opening her hand to let the light touch them. And for a moment she simply stood there, holding what had been given, what had been kept, and what was yet to come. And then she nodded, not to the sheriff, not to the man with the satchel, but to the land itself. And she closed her hand again, turning back toward the house with a quiet certainty in her steps, knowing that what came next would not be about defending what was hers, but about caring for what had chosen to remain. And as the morning continued to unfold, the work of the day began again. Not as a struggle, not as a burden, but as a continuation of something that had been restored, something that did not need to be proven anymore, only lived. The soil turned easily beneath her hands that afternoon, softer than it had any right to be after so many dry seasons, as if it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to press into it with purpose instead of fear. And Eliza knelt near the line where the fence met the open field, the seeds resting in her palm, small and unremarkable to anyone passing by, but carrying a weight she could not measure in ounces or pounds, only in meaning, and she paused before placing them down, her fingers hovering just above the earth, feeling the warmth of the sun still held in the ground. And for a moment, she simply breathed, slow and steady, letting the quiet settle around her like a second skin. And then she pressed the first seed into the soil, not deep, not hidden, just enough to give it a place to begin, and she covered it gently, smoothing the dirt with care, not packing it tight, not forcing it, just guiding it into place the way something living should be guided, and she repeated the motion again and again, spacing them out along the edge where the land opened wide, not in perfect rows, not measured by any tool, but by instinct, by a sense that they should grow where they were needed, where they would belong. And as she worked, the wind moved lightly across the field, carrying the scent of dust and something fresher beneath it, something that had not been there before, and she glanced once toward the hills, the distant line where the land rose and folded into shadow. And though there was no one standing there now, no figure watching, she felt the same quiet presence that had been there before, not as something outside her, but as something shared between the land and those who chose to listen to it. And when she finished, she sat back on her heels for a moment, her hands resting against her knees, the bracelet cool against her wrist now that the sun had shifted, and she looked over the small patches of disturbed earth, each one holding something unseen, something that would take time to reveal itself. And she nodded once, not in certainty, but in acceptance of that time. And behind her, the sound of the wagon returning carried softly across the yard, the sheriff and the older man preparing to leave, their work done for now, their presence no longer needed in the same way. And she rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands as she turned, meeting them near the porch. And the sheriff paused before stepping up, his gaze moving once more across the field, the fence, the line that had been restored, and then back to her. "It will be written properly this time," he said, not as a correction, but as a promise shaped by what he had seen. And Eliza listened, then shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, not in refusal, but in something quieter. "It already is," she said, her voice calm, steady, and the sheriff held her gaze for a moment before nodding, understanding not in full, but enough to respect what she meant, and he placed his hat back on his head, stepping down from the porch with a measured pace, the older man following close behind. And they climbed into the wagon without further words, the wheels turning slowly as they made their way back toward town, leaving behind the land that no longer needed to be argued over, only cared for. And Eliza watched them go for a brief moment before turning back to the field, her eyes drawn again to the places where the seeds lay beneath the surface. And she walked to the nearest one, crouching, slightly to press the soil once more, not to check it, not to correct it, just to feel the connection between what had been given and what she had chosen to do with it. And the wind moved again, stronger. This time, bending the grass along the edge of the field in a long, slow motion, like a breath drawn across the land itself. And she stood, letting it pass over her, through her, carrying with it the last traces of what had been uncertain, leaving behind something steadier, something that did not need to be named to be understood. And as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting a golden light across the field, the fence, the house, and the small places where life had just begun beneath the soil, Eliza stepped back once more, taking in the full stretch of it, not as something she owned, not as something she had defended, but as something she had chosen to remain with. And in that choice, there was no need for more, no need for recognition. Only the quiet knowledge that what had been nearly lost had not only stayed, but had begun again in a way that no one could take. Because it did not belong to force or paper, it belonged to the land, and to those who understood how to listen when it spoke without words. The days did not rush after that. They unfolded the way the land always had, steady and without urgency, each morning carrying a quiet promise that did not need to be spoken. And Eliza found herself moving through them with a different kind of awareness, not watching for what might be taken, but tending to what had remained. And along the line of the fence, small changes began to show, not all at once, not in any way that could be hurried, but in the subtle shift of color in the soil, the faintest green pressing through the earth where the seeds had been placed, fragile at first, almost uncertain, but present, undeniably present. And she would pause there each morning, crouching beside those tiny shoots, her fingers brushing the air just above them, never touching, never forcing, just acknowledging their effort to rise. And the bracelet at her wrist caught the light in those moments, a quiet reflection of something that had been given long before she understood its purpose, and now felt as natural as the breath she took. And the town moved differently too, not dramatically, not with declarations or sudden change, but in small choices. A neighbor stopping by with a tool without needing to be asked, a boy carrying water from the well without waiting for thanks, a woman mending a section of fence that was not hers simply because it stood near her path. And these things did not draw attention. They did not seek recognition. They simply became part of the rhythm, the same way the wind moved through the grass or the sun crossed the sky. And the sheriff passed by more often now, not to inspect, not to question, but to stand for a moment at the edge of the field, his gaze resting on the land as if learning something new each time he looked. And he would nod once when he saw her, a quiet acknowledgement that required nothing more, and then move on, carrying with him a sense of responsibility that had grown deeper than his badge. And beyond the town, the hills remained as they always had, distant and still, holding their own silence. And sometimes, when the light shifted just right at the edge of evening, Eliza would think. She saw movement there, not clearly, not enough to name, just a suggestion of presence that came and went like a memory that did not need to be held onto. And she did not call out, did not seek it, because she understood now that not everything that mattered was meant to stay within reach. Some things simply passed through to remind you of what you already carried. And as the weeks moved on, the green along the fence grew stronger, stretching upward inch by inch, leaves opening to the sun, roots settling deeper into the soil that had accepted them. And the line they formed was not a boundary in the way it had once been. It was something softer, something living, marking the land not with division but with care. And one evening, as the sun lowered behind the hills and the sky turned that deep, quiet gold that only lasted a few minutes before fading, Eliza stood at the edge of the field, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her eyes moving along that living line. And she took a slow breath, the air carrying the scent of growth, of earth, of something continuing. And she felt no need to measure what had been lost or gained, no need to count what had been restored, because the answer was there in front of her, in the way the land held itself, in the way it responded to those who chose to remain with it instead of claiming it. And she turned slightly, her gaze drifting once more toward the distant road, where dust sometimes rose and settled again without meaning. And she did not expect to see anyone there, did not wait for it. And yet there was a moment, brief and quiet, where the horizon seemed to shift, where something moved far beyond sight. And she allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile, not because she knew, but because she did not need to. And the light faded slowly after that, the field settling into shadow, the green along the fence darkening but still visible, still present. And she stepped back toward the house, the porch creaking softly beneath her boots, the door opening with the same familiar sound it always had. And before stepping inside, she paused, turning once more to look at the land, not as something she owned, not as something she had defended, but as something she belonged to, something that had chosen to remember her as much as she had chosen to stay. And in that quiet, there were no words left to say, no lessons to declare, only the simple truth that out here, where the wind carried stories older than any man's claim, justice did not arrive with noise or force. It arrived quietly, in the choice to stand, to care, and to leave behind something that would continue long after you were gone.